Alright guys, we got our knife cut out, and I've filed it all really nice and smooth. I've also taken off those little sharp burrs that were on here with the file as well. I do like to keep it pretty square though, because once it's finished, you're not really going to be able to file on it very well. You can still kind of sand it down with a sander, but I like to keep that squared edge on here. A little bit later, before we heat treat, I am going to round over this sharp edge on the handle, just because we're going to wrap that with paracord, and I don't want it to cut into the paracord at all. But right now I'm going to put a bevel on the knife, and really beveling is kind of the art in this whole thing. I can't really tell you exactly how high to come up with your bevel, just because it really depends on the thickness of your steel. But know that if you have a really steep bevel, then it's going to be really hard to carve with the knife. So I like to have a bevel that's pretty high, but obviously if you come up too high with the bevel, then you're thinning out the spine of your knife here, and you're kind of weakening it a little bit. So I'm going to kind of go with a happy in between. If I can find my marker, here it is. And I like to draw the bevel onto the knife with a marker or something, just to so that when I'm grinding, I know exactly where I'm going. So let's start right here. And it's not that important that it's going to be exact. It's just, we're just giving ourselves a good idea of what we want to take off with the grinder. Okay, so that's the bevel that I'm going to do, pretty much. It's meaning that it's going to start sloping down to the center of the steel here from right here. And then I like to bring it over to the other side by putting a little mark here and a little mark right here. That way I can kind of continue it, and I just kind of pay attention to how high up it goes. I'd like them to be equal, just so it doesn't look weird. And okay, so we've got our bevel drawn out here. Now, a couple of options at this point, once we have our bevel drawn. One is you can just take a file now and file this down, and in fact some people like to do that, where they just put the knife in a vise or something, and then they create some little jig, and they actually take the file, and every little stroke is exactly the same angle. I don't really think you have to be that exact, but this can be a little bit tricky in that there's a lot of metal to take off here, and it's a big surface area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the grinder, and I'm going to grind in here and attempt to kind of grind this down a little bit, so that I don't have to file so much. I'm not trying to get it finished, I'm just trying to grind off some of this metal in here so that I don't have to file so much. The challenge is that if you take off too much metal, or if you make this concave, okay, then your file is not going to be able to get in here to take off any kind of a concave surface, okay? So we want to keep it convex so that when we bring the file in, we can actually take off that hump in the middle. Another thing that's helpful, that is kind of hard to do, but is to try and make yourself a very fine center line down the middle of the blade here. There's actually little scribes that you can use to do this, and they are adjustable, and you can make a little line. I like to actually use a fine tipped marker, finer tipped than this, just like a very fine permanent marker, and just run it along the middle here. I'm going to try and do it with this, but it's kind of fat, so I'm not really confident that I'm going to get a good line down the center. And since I've done this a bunch, it's really not as necessary for me. But you can see I'm drawing a line down the middle here. And what that does is that when I start beveling this, sometimes you can lose track of how much you've taken off from either side. So if you have a line down the middle that you can see, then it's a little bit easier to keep track of how deep you need to go. Okay. but I didn't bring any today. But I'm going to take these little wood shims and I'm going to stick those in there. That way